Channel. And today we're talking about barnwood, and we're going to talk about building with barnwood tips. And one of the examples I'm going to use for you today is a entertainment center that I built out of some beautiful, beautiful old barnwood. And I'll have a second video for you on actually how to build this piece itself. But the first video we'll do today is just talking about how to build with barnwood. And it is a little bit tricky. You'll be doing a lot more measuring with wood that's old, whether it's T&G or shiplap, tongue and groove, whatever you want to call it, than you do with a lot of different kinds of boards, because you're putting those joints together, the tongues and the grooves fitting together, and they don't always fit very well when you have barnwood that's really old. But I do love working with the T&G, and this batch of barnwood that I bought came from a barn in North Dakota. It came off a red barn that was built in 1915. So we're talking about wood that's almost 102 years old, very old, and probably some of the oldest wood that I have ever worked with. So this was quite a challenge for me. Like I said, a lot more measuring over and over and over than I usually have to do, just because so many of the boards, were worn down. This white wood that I picked up off another barn also came out of North Dakota, but this was built probably closer to like 1935. So this white wood is not quite as old as this red barn, and chances are this barnwood in particular may not have come out of North Dakota, because only 1.6% of North Dakota is actually timbered forest. So there's a good chance that back then this kind of most likely a pine, came from another state close by, or maybe even Canada, and probably came in on a train. If it had come from North Dakota, it might have been something more like a cottonwood or an elm, and they have pine there too. But based on the color of some of this wood, my guess is that it was kind of more like a pine. Now, there is such a thing as working with wood that's too old, and a couple of these boards I have in here are a good example of that. As you can see, when this wood starts to really deteriorate, it does start to peel. And then whether you're sanding that or whether you're using like a paint scraper to kind of lift off some of the sharper pieces, you will run into problems where it's actually really gouging into bigger chips, which is really kind of where it ends, because then you just start losing bigger and bigger pieces, and no matter what you do to it, it's still not going to look good. So I would say, like I said, 102 years old was about as far as I was going to go on this lumber, because I was running into problems with this really gouging into bigger chips there. So unfortunately, I had kind of a limited amount of boards. I think I had 50, 60 boards on this project, and no more than that. So I really did have to use some of the boards, no matter what, just to get this piece built in the dimensions that I wanted. So there is such a thing as too old. Again, I don't think I'd go past 100 years old unless you really know more about the condition of that lumber, and like we talked about, where it came from and what kind of wood it was. So lots to think about when you're picking out your barnwood. And then, of course, a lot of people are also really more interested in the actual paint, the condition of the paint or the look of the paint when they're buying those boards. So a lot of the barnwood you get will be gray, and it won't have any paint. But this particular batch I really wanted, because I wanted the reds and I wanted the whites. So what happens over time with a lot of this paint, and you can see the different variations of colors in this, even though it all came off of the same barn. But you can see, like, this red paint up here is a little different color than these boards. So obviously this came off maybe the north side of the barn, where it didn't have as much sun exposure. And of course, back in the 1900s, I'm quite sure they didn't have pressure washers, or maybe even a hose close by. So there's a good chance that when they repainted these barns over and over the years, that there was a lot of dirt stuck on each layer of that paint. So as you start sanding some of this down, and maybe if you go all the way down to the bottom, like in this case, and you get to the actual wood itself, you will get spots where there's actual paint stuck in the, dirt stuck in the paint. And you just have to decide if you want to sand that all off down to the bottom like here, or if you want to leave a little bit of that on there for character. So, in this case, I actually left a little bit of that dirt in there because I just didn't want to get down to the bare bottom of that lumber. So a lot of this has to do with how much character you're actually looking for in your wood. I love character, the more the better. And so you'll get things like, the original nail holes on here, which is the kind of stuff we're looking for. This board was actually split in half, but I used it anyway because I was able to just connect it. So don't throw away those boards either. You'll get gouges in the wood. Like I said, you'll get dirt. You'll get other kind of like black areas where the nails had rusted, and actually rusted the wood. So again, it just kind of depends on how much character you're looking for. I kind of stop with the character when it gets to places where, like I said, you're actually losing some of your material. So, again, lots to think about on what you're using for boards. This piece was even broken, but you know what? It still worked. So I'm just one of those people that uses every inch of my materials I can. I throw out very few scraps, and when I do have scraps left of any kind, I wind up just using it to make something else. So I made 3 or 4 other little small projects out of whatever I had left from my lumber, and made some shelving and all kinds of stuff. So absolutely nothing went to waste on my project. Another thing, a lot of people get a little bit more particular about with their barnwood building is what kind of fasteners that they want to use. I am kind of really big on just using nice heavy-duty star bit screws. A lot of people don't like the fact that you can actually see, the screw heads on this, but I have used finish screws, and they just don't grab as well, and especially when you're using super old wood like this, where you get a lot of warping and a lot of unevenness, and you really need things to tighten up. Sometimes the staples or the finish screws just don't catch. And just don't hold things in place like you really need it. So, and then of course anything with TNG, you have a lot of shifting back and forth with everything kind of being pieced together in panels. So, some people are opposed to using those kind of fasteners, but when I build, most of what I build has to be built real sturdy, and there's a good chance it's going to get moved again because I like to move all my furniture around. So, you may or may not like that kind of a look, but you have a couple different ways to go when you're using your fasteners and some older wood. I do have these handles that I just used a bronze spray paint on, but they also make a rust kit for hardware that I've used before that comes out really nice. I didn't do it on this because I didn't have the time. But the rust kit just basically gives you an option of making all your hardware look like it's rusted. And I have used that before, and it comes out beautiful. It's just a little bit more time consuming. So anyway, let's just go back to picking out your barnwood and building with it. So when you are picking out your barnwood, try and get it literally right off of the barn. The longer this stuff is dismantled and stacked and left on the ground, again, the higher percentage you have of some materials you can't use. So I was very lucky in this case. This barnwood had probably only been sitting in the snow for like 6 months before I started building with it. So you do want to, like I said, find out how long that's been sitting, wherever it's been sitting, and hopefully it's been stacked or stickered and stacked really straight before you get it. And even at that, you will get some warped boards. Sometimes crazy things happen, like this hole right here was actually in one board in particular that I found in my batch, but it worked out perfectly because that's where all my TV cords are going to come through. So even holes like that, you want to pick out stuff like that when you're getting your batch. I do have some pieces in here that actually have writing on the boards, and it was probably something like we're in the barn. They had wrote down oil ratios for tractors or some other kind of ratios for their farm equipment. And I love that kind of stuff too. I have a lot of that on the back side of my pieces and some of the top pieces where you can actually see those numbers. So I love stuff like that. It's just more character, adds to the piece. Like I said, I'm going to give you another video here where we're going to actually talk about how to build this kind of a piece. But again, like I said, when you're picking out your barnwood, obviously know what you're going to build first if you can, because that'll help you give an idea of your dimensions that you're going to need to build with and how much wood you're going to use. And then always giving yourself a little bit of extra materials in case you can't use them. Okay, so a couple other things to think about too when you're picking out your barnwood, especially if you're using TNG, is if you want a beveled board or not. So beveled meaning that it's going to have these indents in it. On every board you'll have an indent. I have bought a lot of TNG without this, without that bevel on it, because I like the full flat surface, especially like on a wall or wainscoting. But it worked out okay on this project. It's just a little bit harder to work with when you have those bevels. And sometimes if you're using the other side of the board, like in this case, it won't have a bevel. And then sometimes it'll have a bevel on both sides. So look at your TNG. Sometimes it'll be just a flush cut on the one side, or a flat cut, and then the other side you'll have a bevel cut like this. And then of course decide which side you're using to build with. So the bevel cut does make it a little trickier to build with, but it's still pretty. And then of course you're looking at how much paint you actually have left on these boards. Now this red barnwood, because it was so much older, I barely even sanded because I just didn't want to take off too much paint. But one thing you have to consider when you buy this wood is how dirty it is. Now I will say this was 100 years old of dirt, and it was from a barn. So when I started just washing this wood, before I even started working with it, just washing it with a hose, it smelled like a barn that was 102 years old. And there was probably actually literally some horse manure still left on the back side of some of these boards. So that's how dirty this lumber was, and it smelled like it when it got wet. But if you use a sprayer on that hose that's too hard, it's going to take off some of that paint. So if you want that paint, or whatever paint's left on it, you definitely do not want to use a pressure washer, because even just a hose with a sprayer that's hard enough will strip off some of this paint, especially when it's this old. So for some reason, this red wood, maybe because it was a different kind of a paint, which was probably a lead paint, and we'll talk about that in a minute, it did not come off, this paint did not come off of the red wood as much as it did on the white. So when I started washing off some of this white wood, I lost a lot of paint, even with just really gently using a hose. So what I did wind up doing, and we'll talk about this in my next video when I talk about actually building this piece, I did have to actually go back over with like a semi-transparent white stain and replace some of the paint that actually came off, because a lot of my boards were just going straight back to gray, and I actually did not want that gray barnwood look. I wanted the white and the red. So you have to be real careful when you're using that hose, or however you choose to wash this, that you literally do not take off too much paint, because then sometimes you have to go back and touch it up again, which I did do. So, and then of course you also have to think about how you're going to finish this lumber. Beyond washing it and beyond sanding some of it. I did have to sand a lot on the back side of these boards because, like I said, it was so old and some of it was really, really rotting. So there was a lot of sanding involved, which sometimes happens with barnwood. And then how you're going to finish that project. So because this piece in particular was going next to my wood stove in my living room, I did have to finish this with like kind of a real thick polyurethane, because I was concerned about the heat that was going to be in this room from the wood stove really affecting that wood. And obviously I'm hoping this piece lasts another 100 years. So I did go back and use a kind of a real thick polyurethane to coat this in kind of a matte to a satin sheen, so you can see that it's a little bit shiny, which I really don't want, because you still want it to look old, but it is absolutely protecting this wood from getting too hot or deteriorating anymore. So again, it depends on the look you want. I've built a lot of pieces that I didn't finish at all, after I sanded it, but it also wasn't near the heat. So, of course, when you're picking out your wood, you're also thinking about where that wood's actually going to go, if it's going to be inside or outside. So most of my pieces, if they're indoor, I do not polyurethane unless I have to. And I will say on this redwood, it was literally chipping off, even when you just touched it. So just to keep what was left on there of that red paint from chipping, I had to seal it anyway. So I do like to seal it. It does preserve it, and it also brings out a much richer grain, even beyond the paint, when you seal something, like with the polyurethane. And again, I'll talk about that kind of a finish more in my next video, where we talk about actually building this cabinet. And that's because there's a couple different ways to seal or polyurethane your pieces. But this one, like I said, was just one thick coat to really protect it from the heat. So a couple other things to think about when you're picking out your barnwood is whether this is an old growth wood, which means the original forest. It probably hasn't been replanted, and this is really that old of the wood. Old growth tends to be better lumber because it's just a more solid, stable grain. So you might want to ask too if it's old growth lumber, if they know that information or not when you're buying it. But it is super important to ask whoever you're purchasing this barnwood from a lot of questions. There's a lot of people out there that are going to tell you it's barnwood, and you're going to maybe be paying for a price, that you shouldn't be, because it's probably not as old as they say it is. And then again, you don't want to pay too much for something that's too old that you can't even work with. So make sure whoever you're purchasing your barnwood from, you're asking them lots of questions. And of course, most of that has to do with where it came from, what kind of wood it is, and how it was left to dry once it was dismantled. There's other pieces you can buy, obviously, from whoever's selling it to you, other than the walls or the siding of the barn. You can buy the beams, you can buy posts if they have them, you can buy 2x4s, take everything. Because, like I said, you're also going to need pieces for framing besides the actual panels that you're building. And again, we'll talk about that in the video when I tell you how to build this. But you don't want just the walls itself. You want, a couple other good pieces to use for building. So lots of pieces of barnwood that you can utilize. And then something else you want to ask the person you're buying this from is if they know whether or not this paint contains lead. Now, chances are anything prior to 1978, 30, 40 years old, probably does have lead paint in it. Which is pretty, typical for especially exterior buildings and predominantly, outbuildings like barns. So pretty good chance that the barnwood you're buying, if it still has paint on it, contains lead. And I did do a video for you guys, which you can look up on a toy barn that I built for my daughter out of the same lumber, and it does talk a little bit more about the dangers of building with lead paint, especially if that piece is for a child or going in a child's room. But there is a lead surface test kit that you can buy. And again, you can go back to one of my other videos where I talk a little bit more about lead paint dangers in detail. So again, because I did test this wood and I knew with a test kit and I knew it was lead paint, this was absolutely an outdoor project. If you have a shop that has some really good ventilation, and or you're wearing a mask when you're doing this indoors, that's a good idea. But this, for me, was an outside project in the middle of summer with a mask. You couldn't believe how much dirt, like I talked about, how much dust, and how much paint obviously was flying around, and this was in a completely open area. And it was all over my clothes and you name it. So again, I can't stress to you enough, if you are getting into some of these bigger barnwood projects that have paint, please wear a mask or make sure you're in a really well ventilated area, or at least outside, like I was. And like I said, this was probably one of the dirtiest, dustiest lead paint projects that I've ever done. So, think about those things too when you're buying stuff with paint on it, as opposed to just the barnwood that has nothing left on it. And I hope that helps you think about some of the things that you need to consider before you even purchase barnwood. So beyond purchasing your wood, like I said, this is going to be a little bit more time consuming for you because there's measuring 2 and 3 and 4 times sometimes with pieces that have to fit together this tightly. So good project, time consuming for me, lots of learning in terms of measuring and making things fit, but it did come out just kind of how I planned it. And so think about how you're going to finish your piece. And if you're interested in seeing my next video on how to actually build an entertainment center panel by panel, you can look for that. And if you have any other questions, come and see me on my website, Susie Homesteader of the Rockies, and I will see you there. Bye-bye. So, let's get started. Subscribe to the Susie Homesteader channel, and we'll see you there. Bye-bye.